program of decision support tools, of artistic creativity that we've had through our AHRC funded projects. We're planning to do that in Hull on the 12th and 13th of September. And then we're planning a final conference covering a lot of the science that the program has done, and also, its policy and practice implications. And that's scheduled for, well, almost exactly a year from now in London. So please put that in your diaries. So next up, we've got Daniela Schmidt from the University of Bristol. Daniela is a professor in the School of Earth Sciences at the University of Bristol, and her particular research area focuses on marine socio-ecological systems, and she was one of the convening lead authors of one of these regional chapters that zooms into a particular region, and she focused on Europe with several other colleagues. And Mike Morecroft is in Natural England. He leads the science team, and he's an ecologist by background. So he's been looking at climate change adaptation mitigation and providing policy advice in Natural England. And he led the chapter on terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. So they're going to do a double act, first covering some of the key messages of the report, and then going into a little bit more detail into these chapters that they've led. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Daniela, to share your screen and to take us through the major findings of this very large report. We can see your slides.
Thank you very much for inviting us to come here and to talk with you about the report. We are the first of two presentations. The next one is next Wednesday, where two of the Summersby chapter authors will come to you. But because we've decided we would cover the SPM first. If you want to sum up these 3,500 pages, then the main message is the science is clear, that any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. This report, while portrayed in the media very much as the doom and gloom, hopefully provides solutions and adaptation options as well as climate resilient development. What's new in the report is our understanding of the interconnections of biodiversity loss, the climate crisis, inequity, growing urbanization, and unsustainable use of natural resources. And all of the parts of the report are really trying to bring these parts together, thinking of how adaptation and mitigation go hand in hand, as well as human society and ecosystems and biodiversity. Our remit is impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. And I'd like to start with the vulnerability part, because it's a striking number that 3.3 to 3.6 billion people in the world live in hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. In these regions, people face overlapping challenges of limited access to water, sanitation, and health, often have climate-sensitive livelihoods or high levels of poverty. And this is combined with weak leadership, lack of funding, and lack of accountability and trust in government. While these hotspots are predominantly in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America, we like to emphasize that even in regions with low vulnerability, like Europe, we have people who have much higher vulnerability than others. One of the other key messages of the report is that our risks are becoming more and more complex, that compound hazards are resulting in compounding cascading risks. And the example here draws on the increasing heat and drought, which not just impacts our crop yields, but also provides heat stress for farm workers and therefore reduced labor productivity. These jointly then result into increased food prices, reduced household incomes, and therefore have interacting and compounding impacts. One of the other key messages of the report is about nature's crucial role in reducing some of the impacts, but also its own vulnerability to a warming world. a wide range of ecosystem services I looked at, such as pollination, coastal protection, our desire to enjoy the natural world, food, but also regulating services such as clean air, climate regulation, and water filtration. One of the points I want to point out here very clearly is health. There is a huge emphasis and a growing body of literature in the report about the impact of climate change on mental health in the world. The global and regional risks are portrayed both, and I'm just trying to, because of the brevity of time, focus on the global narrative here. What you can see on the left-hand side are the projections from Working Group 1 under different climate scenario and population and economic development until 2100, some of which, as you know, are more likely than others. Our remit, though, was to look at the risks which are derived from that. And what you can see here are the classical burning embers for the reasons for concern. You can see them here about unique and threatened systems, such as the loss of glacier and the waters they provide, ecosystems such as corals and wetlands. You can see the distribution of impacts, the aggregating impacts, and large-scale events. And the main take-home message from this figure is that all of those reasons for concern are becoming very high during plausible climate change scenario, and that the onset of these moving from high to very high has come down compared to AR5. So therefore stating that because of extreme events and how they materialize, we understand more that those reasons for concern will become much more urgent than we previously thought. The main risks we are focusing on are heat stress, water scarcity, food security, and flood risk. And I will draw on some of those when I talk about the regional part in Europe. And I'm handing over to Mike now.
Thank you, Dani. So adaptation, it's the response, or one of the responses to this, isn't it? And the fact is that when we reviewed the literature, there has been action on adaptation. It has increased since the last IPCC report, but progress is uneven, and overall we're not adapting fast enough. The risks are growing faster than the adaptation effort to reduce those risks. Just to run through a couple of examples, and I'll talk a little bit more on the ecosystem ones when I come to that. But water management is perhaps one of the best understood series of adaptation measures where there has been more progress, still not enough, but there has been some. And we can see options on farms can include irrigation, rainwater storage, moisture conservation in soils. But it's really important to understand as well that a lot of those often come with downsides as well. For example, irrigation removes water from other uses. So it's really important to take the wider perspective, and you have some of the options down here as well about working with nature and land use planning, for example, to ensure we don't get those kind of trade-offs occurring. Next slide, please, Danny. Food security, another area where adaptation is a priority. And you can see things around cultivar improvements to fit crops better for a changing climate. But also the role of things like agroforestry and the diversification of farm landscapes and community adaptation. It's not just about the scientific fixes, and strengthening biodiversity comes in there again. It's how you farm, and the human dimensions really matter. And one of the things we do see with good adaptation measures is they often have wider benefits as well. For example, here, food security, health and well-being, and livelihoods. Next, please. Cities are a key area for adaptation. Urbanization is taking place globally on a huge scale. By 2050, 2/3 of the world's population may live in cities. We can see there's a range of different options there, both natural and engineering-based, green and blue spaces, and things like urban agriculture. But again, the human dimension is really important. Social safety nets for disaster management. And again, done well, it comes with a lot of other co-benefits around, for example, public health improvement. Next slide, please. Now, you've probably heard me mention done well and other caveats to some of this. And we've also had new evidence showing that maladaptation, doing adaptation badly with adverse consequences, is also a reality. One of the highlights or lowlights, if you like, on that issue is what happens in coastal zones. There are downsides of hard flood defences done badly. For example, in many cases, it may be better to have a more natural sort of approach, like the one you have on the right here, to reduce flood risks. But also there are risks to people from having poor flood defences, as on the left. You give people a false sense of security, as well as potentially coming at a cost to the natural environment from hard flood defences. So doing the right thing in the right place is important to avoid maladaptation. And there are limits. Even effective adaptation will not prevent all losses and damages. And particularly above 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, the level identified in the Paris Agreement as the target to try and hold global warming levels to, we start to run into problems. Some of the natural solutions, some of the nature-based solutions to climate change don't work as well because of the vulnerability of ecosystems themselves. We can see also a lack of fresh water, and as a result of rising sea levels, but also the loss of glaciers and snowmelt. Glaciers are a really important part of the water supply for millions upon millions of people. And by 2 degrees, it can be challenging to grow some of the staple crops that people are used to. I hope from what's emerging from all we've been saying is that climate change adaptation is critical. We need to do more of it, but it can't be approached in isolation. And the concept of climate resilient development is one that is featured to a high extent in this report. It's not a term perhaps that's familiar to that many of us, but it's trying to capture the idea that we need to have a holistic approach. We need to reduce climate change risks through adaptation, but that also needs to be seen in the context of reduced greenhouse gas emissions and the need for mitigation, and alongside other wider agendas, for example, the protection of biodiversity and enhancement of it, and more broadly, achieving sustainable development goals. All of these impact on each other. So, thank you. What are the hallmarks? What's the framework, if you like, for climate resilient development? Well, first of all, it needs to be considered across government and all of society. It's not just the job of one or the other. And involving everyone in partnership approach is critical. And included in that is drawing on different types of knowledge. Scientific knowledge, like exemplified in the IPCC over many years, for sure, but also the expertise of local people and practitioners. And very importantly, Indigenous knowledge, which has been a real feature of this report, to try and understand better how Indigenous people's knowledge and often close and sustainable working with the land can give us lessons we can learn from, as well as being important to protect them. The conservation and restoration of ecosystems is integral to climate resilient development. And it's also really important that we involve marginalized groups and prioritize equity and justice. It makes sense when you think about it, doesn't it, that if you are somebody with few resources, with not much say in how the world around you is managed, your options for adaptation are much reduced compared to those who are more empowered and wealthier. And this is a global issue, so reconciling different interests, values, and worldviews is a critical element to successful climate resilient development. And the bottom line, which probably won't come as a surprise, is that there is a need for scaled up investment and international cooperation on a large scale. So climate resilient development then is already a big challenge to achieve all of those things, even at today's global warming levels. But as the climate warms, the options decrease. And 1.5 degrees is probably the best that we can achieve. And that's a stretch, as we know, in terms of climate change mitigation. But it's important to remember, if we go above that, the options for adaptation start to close off. And the little figure on the right shows that actually there are numerous paths which, as societies, we can take. And there are multiple options. At this stage, anyway, there are different approaches that will work in different places. But as the climate warms, the options narrow and the pathways diminish. Next slide. So I'm finishing where we started with this overview of the summary for policymakers. The science is clear. Any further delay in concerted global action on both adaptation and mitigation will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. Back to you, Danny.
So what I'm trying to do with the Europe chapter, which is very dense in information, is not to delve into any of those figures in more detail. What I'm trying to do is to give you an overview of what is there so that you feel interested in having a look at the report yourself. What we have done is predominantly frame it in a 1.5 versus 3 degree world. We are starting with in each of those, so the chapter basically reflects the report and goes through all of the large systems. And it provides evidence of the impacts which we already see. And importantly, that these are different across the regions and across societal groups, therefore deepening inequalities. The main impacts you'll see coming up and again is the impact of extreme heat, which of course is higher if you go into the southern Europe, versus the impacts of, in this case, maximum one-day precipitation, which impact a really large part of Europe with increases in flood risks. We've identified 4 main key risks for Europe. These are the impact of heat on mobility and mortality of people, on marine and terrestrial ecosystems, manifesting at slightly different degrees because of climate refugia in the terrestrial versus the much more connected space in the marine. The impacts of heat and drought on crop production. And all of these will accelerate with increasing warming, resulting in more heat death, more heat stress, loss of habitats, and loss of crops. Key risk 3 focuses very much on water scarcity, and we've assessed it differently for the different regions. And as you would expect, it materializes first in Southern Europe and then later in Western and Central Europe. And key risk 4 focuses on flooding, both along rivers and coasts, as well as the impact it has on long-living infrastructure, but also our cultural heritage along those coasts. All of those risks accelerate with increasing warming. What we're trying to do then is have a huge number of maps. This is the one on heat stress on people under different, predominantly RCP, but in this case, RCP-SSP joint assessments. So most of the adaptation literature, and I don't tell you anything there, is of course still working with the older climate models and not with the CMIP6. What you can see here is the huge impact on heat, on thermal comfort, and the limits to adaptation it will have, particularly in Southern and in Eastern Europe. What we have tried for many of those risks, these are the same burning embers you saw earlier, showing the impact adaptation can make in risk reduction. And what we are trying here for Northern Europe and for Southern Europe is to show what adaptation pathways might look like. Again, I'm not going into more details, but what we're trying to do is to look at the different interventions. So heat proofing here, air conditioning, building interventions, as well as the very important behavioral changes, and showing that some of these might be available at low levels of warming and are instantaneously available. Some of them will take more time to implement, and many of them will lose if warming is accelerating. Even if we're combining them, we cannot remove the risk. For all of the systems, we also have done overviews of observed impacts projected at 1.5 degrees and projected at 3 degrees for the individual regions and subregions. This is an overview example from the terrestrial ecosystems, but you would find it for other systems as well, where we're looking at the effects of climate change driven by a number of climate hazards, interacting with non-climatic hazards, and then leading to those impacts. Many of those have already materialized. All of them are becoming stronger with increasing warming. And for example, in terrestrial ecosystems, these will lead to irreversible impacts, to the loss of climatically suitable conditions, and therefore at the beginning migration and ultimately extinction. Here portrayed in the top row for 1.5 degrees and in the bottom for slightly over 3 for plants, insects and mammals. But the sectorial chapters have more examples here showing the real threat it has for the ecosystems, for groups of organisms, their ecosystems, but also if you think about insects, many of these are pollinators for the services they provide. What is really important to us is to think about how we can reduce some of those stresses, and protected areas, habitat restoration, protection, and the agroecology, with Mike had mentioned earlier, are examples. But what's important for us is to emphasize, as you can highlighted here on a marine example, the 3 different regions we have, so the southern, transitional and northern European seas. What you can see is the big block is the area of that in the darker blue, the protected, where we have no idea if they have been implemented and if they have management plans. And then in the dark, those which have been implemented in a high protection. And you'll see that this is a really small part of our marine areas. As I said, Curious 2 looks at crop losses, and what we have done is to look at some of those adaptation options, such as the impact of irrigation, but also therefore the lock-ins and the path dependencies we are going on with water demands for irrigation, which is sufficient in some parts of Europe at the moment, but will definitely not be available as an effective adaptation option if warming becomes too high on the pathways we're currently on. And similarly, as I showed earlier, we have those overview tables, which are the basis of those adaptation pathways. So for here crops, we're talking about irrigation and vegetation cover, changes in farming practices, the crops and animal species, the shifting of timing of planting and harvesting. But what we've looked at those is what is economically feasible, what's technologically available, where do we have the institutional frameworks to make things work, what is culturally and acceptable. So, GM might be one of those things which is more challenging there. What is the impact on ecology, and what's the confidence we have that these options really work? And you can see some of these are high assessment scores with big bubbles, where we know, and farming practice has shown us, that sowing and harvesting can reduce risks, but also some where we don't really know. For example, GM or some of the management options, how effective they really are. For sea level rise, what we try to do with that key risk is to really look at what's the planning, what's the national adaptation planning. And what you can see here in blue is the amount of sea level rise which is considered in this national adaptation planning. And if there's a plus on top, they are planning for the real high-end, long-term committed sea level rise. At the right, the red shows you how many people, what the population currently at risk are. And there are some regions with severe population at risk and no adaptation planning. One of the points I want to raise as well is that our European cities are hotspots for many of those risks where they're coming together. We have increased risk for energy supply. We have impacts on transport and infrastructure. We have impacts on air quality and high water demands. And we are trying, similar in fashion here, to have a look at some of those risks for cities. And finally, it's important to recognize that we are part of a global supply chain. Last year when that ship was stuck in the Suez Canal, I think we all recognized again how interdependent we are. And the current geopolitical backdrop is a reminder of some of the energy dependencies. This figure here shows the virtual water flows of both green and blue water in our agricultural products, which we are getting to the European Union, including UK at the time of the assessment. And this is done for soy, coffee, cocoa, palm oil, cotton, grapes, lots of those products where we have strong dependency on other countries. And so it's important to recognize that even if we have a lower physical risk, there's a lot of our climate risk emerges from where we sit in financial markets and food production. So to end, climate resilient development in Europe, adaptation is happening, but it's not at the scale, depth, or speed to avoid risks. The measures we currently exist or we have planned are not sufficient to avoid risks, especially if warming is over 1.5 degrees. These residual risks are losses of habitats and ecosystem services, heat-related death, crop failures, water rationing during droughts, and loss of land with too much sea level rise. If warming would go above 3 degrees, a combination of many, maybe even all adaptation options are needed. And so we really need to use windows of opportunity, such as budget cycle, policy evaluation, infrastructure investment, or the COVID recovery programs to make Europe a more resilient place. I'm handing back to Mike with our tag teaming.
Thank you.
And of course now, sorry, Mike, yeah, there we are.
Marvelous. Yeah, so again, I'll follow the same pattern of looking at the impacts and then the future potential risks, and then come on to some of the adaptation questions and more climate resilient development issues. So in terms of the impacts on ecosystems, and I should say I'm going to largely draw on chapter 2 here, which is the terrestrial freshwater ecosystems, but I will briefly touch on some of the marine systems as well. But anyway, in terms of the impacts, we did find that there was new evidence since the last AR5 report that many observed changes in ranges, phenology, physiology, and morphology of terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems, freshwater species, can be attributed to climate change, both regional and global. And that increased strength of confidence in attribution is one of the real features here. We are seeing changes, and we can increasingly say with confidence which of those are most likely to be caused by climate change, and indeed for which there's no other plausible answer. And one of the key things that does come out is the role of extreme events, droughts, floods, wildfire, particularly, in driving that change. And there are some quite startling statistics when you take the overview of the evidence that's been emerging. Something like half of species assessed globally have shifted their ranges either to higher latitudes or higher elevations, reflecting where suitable conditions are, tracking cooler conditions. And it's not just species, we can also see changes in biomes. Now, biomes are the large-scale patterns of vegetation at the global level. So, for example, the contrast between a forest, let's say a tropical forest, and a savanna. So very big scale patterns of change, and the borders between those are shifting. We can also see evidence of extinctions now, probably 3 species which are either extinct or very nearly extinct, where there's a clear link to climate change at a global scale, but also local population extinctions, where a species is no longer found in a place where it used to be, are becoming increasingly common. Something like 47% of 976 species for which that was examined, and often with an association with the hottest years. So there's a sort of fingerprints of change. Yeah, carry on, thanks. That slide's the next one. And it's worth reflecting that many of the changes in ecosystems which were projected in earlier IPCC reports are now being observed as actual realized impacts. And this is quite a dense amount of information on this map, but essentially all of the little symbols show where there's observations of change in the dominant plant functional type. When I say functional type, it means what defines that ecosystem, trees in a forest or so on. So these changes at the biome scale, for example, the colonization of trees going into the tundra, and you can see really across many areas of the world, there are observations of change at these boundaries between big ecosystem types. Next slide. And if we project forward into the future, we can see there are trajectories of biodiversity loss, and they are dependent on what level of global warming we find. So on the left, the sort of increasingly red symbols indicate where projections are for species being lost from areas, not necessarily globally extinct, but from within those areas. And you can see, there are still some worrying figures up in the tens of percentages at 1.5 degrees of global warming. If we take it to 3 degrees of global warming, some really very alarming local extinctions projected, with well above half of the current species being lost from places. So global warming levels really matter. Let's move on to look a little bit more at the projected risks. And again, it's those so-called burning embers. And if you just sort of stand back and look at the big picture, and these are all different aspects of ecosystem impacts, overall biodiversity loss, carbon loss from ecosystems, and on the left-hand side is terrestrial, right-hand side is marine. The sort of grey line at about 1 degree is where we are now. So we're coming into a zone where there is significant increasing potential of the loss and the damage. And one stands out as being already in that space, and that's the warm water corals, which is sort of in the middle of the screen there. Let's move on then. So the key question is, well, what can we do? Can we do anything apart from reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which we need to do, to build resilience and to adapt to this change? So some of the main things we can do to adapt for ecosystems. Well, first of all, we can protect and restore ecosystems. We have much clearer evidence now that a degraded, fragmented habitat is more vulnerable to climate change. Different pressures interact. So protection and restoration of ecosystems is a key element in building that resilience to climate change. We also do find that there are places, which are often termed refugia, where species can persist, where conditions remain locally cooler. For example, at higher altitudes or on north-facing slopes. Even if species are declining elsewhere, there may be places where they can survive, and we can target our efforts around those. But there's no doubt change is happening, and we can't prevent all of those changes. So planning for adaptation to manage those inevitable changes needs to become a much bigger part of conservation and sustainable environmental management. And when we look to see whether some of this planning was actually taking place, that's the last point on the slide here, we find a lot of plans, we don't find a lot of evidence of whether they're being implemented, and where they are being implemented, we find very little evidence that people have evaluated the success of specific measures. We can see enough information to know what will build resilience, for example, and what we might need to do to manage change, but to actually see where a specific measure in a particular place has been implemented and then assessed, that's something we don't see a lot of, and it's something I think is really important going forward for the adaptation community, not just for biodiversity adaptation, but more broadly as that monitoring and evaluation, learning from doing. Next slide. One of the other key points that came out is around the importance of using natural approaches to reduce the vulnerability to people, so-called ecosystem-based adaptation, and sometimes also termed nature-based solutions. And we can see that there are multiple benefits from doing that. So there is hope in that sort of integrated approach where we look at people and nature as part of one system. And some of the examples there around natural flood management, urban cooling, and better management of wildfire risk. But it's really important this is done in a way that's respectful of local conditions with local people fully on board, and also remembering the potential vulnerability that those approaches have because of to climate change itself, and avoiding some of the risks of maladaptation. And we also come up with good evidence of where, particularly for mitigation measures, there have been adverse effects. For example, the planting of trees on savannas and peatlands. And if we go on to the last slide, which in this section, and this is from the summary for policymakers, and it's a very clear statement that safeguarding biodiversity and ecosystems is fundamental to climate resilient development for people as well as for nature. And if you look carefully, you'll see there's a figure there of effective conservation of 30 to 50% of the Earth's surface to reduce those risks at the global scale, as well as the local interventions. And to actually have that recognised in a report of this sort, I think it's a really important development. That's me finished. So I think we're heading back to James.
Indeed, thank you very much, Mike and Daniela, for that excellent overview of the report. I will hand over to James Pearce-Higgins, who's Director of Science at the British Trust for Ornithology, to provide a response and discuss some implications for the UK. Over to you, James.
Thank you. And hopefully you can see my first slide. And really what I want to do is just pull out some of the key statements from the summary for policymakers and start to link that back to our situation here in the UK. And I'm not going to make any apologies where I'm from for focusing particularly on the kind of ecosystems and species side of things, but that I think represents quite a lot of cross-cutting issues as we've already heard. So one of the key statements that we've already heard about is that of human-induced climate change impacts causing widespread adverse impacts and damages to nature. We've got a good history in the UK of understanding these impacts. We've known for a long time about shifts in species distributions northwards, as shown by this graph here, for quite a wide range of different taxa. So there's that strong fingerprint. And at the BTO, we published this report last autumn to coincide with the Glasgow COP that summarised the evidence for what we know about the impacts of climate change on the UK's birds. And this graph is really one of the key results. So we separated species into those when we know their populations respond negatively to temperature, where they show no overall evidence of response, or they show positive responses to temperature, warming, for example, improving survival rates or breeding success. And then if we look at the long-term population trends of those species over 25 years, we can see that those species which show negative responses to temperature have generally been in decline and shown on average about a 25 to 30% population decline over that time frame. Whereas the other groups of species are either showing mixed responses or positive responses to population change over that time frame. So really emphasizing what Mike has said, that there is much stronger evidence that our natural systems are being impacted by climate change now. And that attribution has really strengthened through time. There's a really strong fingerprint of climate change. So looking to the future in terms of the future vulnerability of ecosystems to climate change, and again, as Mike showed with those maps, that differs substantially between and among regions. And here actually in the UK, we are one of those places, fortunately, where perhaps we're much less vulnerable to large-scale negative impacts of climate change for many of our sort of taxa compared to perhaps other parts of the world. And that's because we've got a strong latitudinal gradient in species richness. So for groups, as you can see from this kind of assessment here of species vulnerability to climate change for a wide range of taxa that we did for England a few years ago. Many of our invertebrate groups, ants, bees and wasps, are good examples in point, have got southerly focused distributions, and many of those species are likely to expand their ranges northwards in response to climate change, and therefore potentially have a good opportunity for range expansion. Whereas it's particularly some of the plants, some of the bryophytes and the vascular plants, particularly associated with sort of, biodiverse areas of the uplands and the sort of wet woodlands of Scotland and the West, where there's particularly high vulnerability to climate change. And if we drill down into looking at some of these groups in a bit more detail, focusing here particularly on the birds, where each graph, we've separated each species out into their habitat associations and stacked up their assessment by risk. we can see here that global warming does represent kind of a near-term multiple risk to ecosystems, but that magnitude of risk kind of increases and differs between different habitats. So you'll highlight here the particular vulnerability of our seabirds, like the puffin here, in the marine species focused and reliant on the marine environment to climate change, and the vulnerability of birds in our uplands, these cold adapted, cold associated species, which again are highly vulnerable to negative effects of climate change. So those impacts are varied and will increase and get worse the harder and the more we have warming above 1.5 degrees centigrade. So therefore, kind of the fourth kind of key statement really is that depending on the magnitude of future global warming, climate change will lead to numerous risks, and therefore there's an imperative for climate change mitigation. And I mean, indeed, the focus in this country on net zero is showing good progress. I think we're doing a good job of decarbonising our energy sector, but that does come with risks, and we know that there are potentially negative impacts of biodiversity associated with aspects of renewable energy. But there are ways and solutions to kind of solving that problem by understanding where those vulnerable species are located, as we've done for wind farms, both on land and now out to sea, and then having robust impact assessment processes. And that's an approach now that we're working with the Forestry Commission and others to apply to the forestry sector, where obviously there's an urgent need for large-scale tree planting for climate change mitigation, but again, can have negative impacts on open country species that are vulnerable to and of conservation concern, like the curlew here. But as Mike said, there are positives and positive progress in adaptation across sectors, and particularly considering kind of human and natural systems together is important. And a really good example of these multiple benefits is that of our work in the peatlands. I think there is good evidence now for positive effects of peatland restoration, blocking drainage ditches, as shown here by the National Trust in the Peak District, which raises water levels, restores some of these eroding sites, and it's good for mitigation, it's good for adaptation. These peatlands are now more resilient to the negative effects of summer warming, and it's good for biodiversity. So there are these win-win solutions that we need to prioritise and focus on. And this evidence is building, as Mike has said. This is a graph from a sort of literature mapping and systematic and analysis that we've been involved with, which particularly shows that species-focused adaptation measures on the right-hand side there have actually got quite a high probability of being effective in terms of moderating species responses to extreme events or to temperature. But even lower other more generic measures associated with land or water management or land and water protection have got the potential for benefiting a wide range of species. So this evidence for the effectiveness of climate change adaptation is building, and obviously emphasizes the value of that effective conservation moving forward, as Mike suggested. But there is still that limited evidence about specific interventions, the extent to which those adaptation is taking place, and evaluating those adaptation measures. So I just want to conclude really by making reference to this paper that just came out in the last week in Ecological Indicators. It's open access, where we've set out recognizing some of these challenges for monitoring and measuring the success of adaptation, a framework by which you could do that. So tracking the enabling conditions that are needed for effective adaptation to occur, the adaptation actions that are undertaken, their short-term ecological impacts, and then through time in terms of the results-based indicators, demonstrating how well those adaptation interventions actually moderate species responses to climate change, and ultimately measure the long-term impacts of that adaptation in terms of increased resilience of species and systems to cope with climate change. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, James, for providing that UK perspective on the report. And thanks everyone for submitting your questions. Do keep them coming, and please do use the upvote function to vote for questions that you like to be asked. I'm going to kickstart with Ivan Bjorn's question, which goes right back to the beginning of your talk, Daniela, around he's asking about 3 to 3.6 billion of the most vulnerable. So he's asking whether that vulnerability is from climate change, or is it because of poverty or low GDP on those countries? That means they have less capacity to adapt. I wonder if you or Mike would be able to clarify that one.
This is vulnerability to climate change and not vulnerability from climate change. So we have there's a funny risk propeller, which is talking about exposure vulnerability. And so this is also not taking the exposure component. So it's not if people are living near a coastline. This really looks at a large number of measures. Are there health systems in place? Is it economically able to adapt? Is there an ability to migrate and not to be displaced? So it takes a large number of national measures of adaptation, of vulnerability into consideration.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. My colleague here, Pearce-Foster, is asking a little bit about the the framing of the SPM. I guess he's questioning whether it's too negative, for example, and it'd be interesting to hear your views about whether, you know, he's sort of asking whether the community is making the perfect the enemy of the good here in this question. I wonder whether Mike or Daniela would want to take that one.
Yeah, I think it's a fair challenge, you know? And I will share that the SPM writing team, of which we were both part, had quite a debate actually about the tone to take and the balance between light and dark, as our co-chairs put it. The intention was not to be entirely gloomy, but neither was it to offer false hope that there's easy answers here. And once you factor that combination of adaptation and mitigation together, you know, it's challenging. And that, I think that brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity is the key phrase here. You know, don't lose sight of the fact there is opportunity, okay? It's not a lost cause. We still can do something, but nevertheless, if we hang around too long or our efforts are too half-hearted, it won't be sufficient. So there is a balance there. Whether we got that right or wrong may say as much about the reader of the report, I suspect. I'm not going to comment more on that. In terms of whether the perfect's the enemy of the good, that's true. You have to be practical, and feasibility is a big thing that comes through. But I would say that it has to be adequate. The response has to be adequate, and we shouldn't kid ourselves that a sort of a half-hearted response is going to be up to the challenge. So yeah, hang on to that window of opportunity if, like me, you're a glass half full person, and let's try and seize it.
But I also like to disagree with Pearce a little bit. If you look at the change between AR5, which he's very familiar with, compared to AR6, the part where we describe what the risks are is much, much shorter, much more brevity in that. There's such an emphasis of these are the options we have. These are the paths we can go in, and this is how climate resilient development could look like. That it's regrettable that the focus is all on the risks in the wider communication.
Okay. Thanks both. I've got a question here that's quite big, but I think I'd quite like to ask it, which is about implementation. And I think you covered it a little bit, but it'd be good to hear, you know, a bit more. This is from Helen McIntyre. What level of adaptation are we aiming for? Do we have good examples, case studies of what successful adaptation looks like? Will there be some level of risk impact that we will have to live with, and who makes that decision? It's some really big questions here, but I thought I'd pose them for all three of you to get your reactions, at least on bits of their questions. Who'd like to go first?
I'll give it a start and then we'll hand over to Mike and James. I think what successful adaptation is one where lots of different stakeholders were sitting around the table to find out what works at a given place and for whom. Because something which is considered to be a good adaptation option for one place will not be the same for the other. Adaptation also doesn't work, and that's the same for human systems or for natural systems, if someone remotely or just one person makes a decision. Because, you know, one of the examples we're giving is that having parks in cities and greening infrastructure is beautiful. It helps with air quality, it provides habitat, but it also gentrifies those neighborhoods and makes them less livable for people who might have lived there before. And so it's really important that whatever adaptation options are discussed, that everyone's invited to have their views heard.
Yeah, that's a really important point. In terms of whether we have good examples and case studies, yes, we do. And you know, it is a very long report. There's no doubt. It's an encyclopedia, and I, you know, it should be a really useful resource for the next few years. So do dip into it. Certainly in chapter 2 we have some case studies, but they are there in various other places as well. I think the concept of success is quite a difficult one sometimes in the context of adaptation. But no, we can certainly see ways of reducing risk. That, you know, that there is some evidence to back up that they're doing good, and also providing wider benefits. And that again, I think, is on the, you know, on the sort of the optimistic side, is that, you know, actually with some of these things, you know, there may be costs, but there may be multiple benefits that go beyond adaptation, and that's part of success. In terms of the last part of the question, will there be some level of risk stroke impact we will have to live with, and how to make that decision? Yes, absolutely. And more than risk and impact, there will be loss and damage. You know, we're already seeing it. So that is there. As to who makes the decision, now that's a really interesting one. Now, I'm a natural scientist, as you know, but we've had a big social science component this time round, and some of them will be speaking next week. But the concept of inclusive governance actually is a big one here. And actually, we need to share that decision making as much as we can feasibly, you know, and at a local scale. You know, much adaptation is local, and you know, everyone needs to have a bit of a share in that decision making because it affects everyone. But you know, perhaps come back to that next week.
Thanks, Mike. Do you want to come in, James, on this one?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I think it's an excellent question, and I think you know, one of the additional things that's worth emphasising is that what that success looks like can also vary with increasing levels of climate change as well. So in the short term, you know, and up to a particular level, you know, we might be looking to maintain vulnerable populations, you know, in particular places where they are. But if our ability to adapt is exceeded by the magnitude of climate change, then we have to shift our focus. So, you know, really kind of echo what Claudia said, really, in terms of needing to get that wide range of stakeholders together to understand, you know, what those needs are, and to be flexible. But as I've kind of said in my presentation, there is definitely building evidence that if you've got particular species of vulnerability, and I'm just focusing on that kind of natural environment side of things at the moment, you know, there is actually a lot we can do to help manage that vulnerability. But whether, you know, that is ultimately an effective thing to do relative to other uses of that resources, or, you know, wider interests as far as adaptation is concerned, is a wider question. And these are things that are also discussed in that ecological indicators paper that I made reference to as well.
Okay, thanks all. I think I'm going to try to squeeze in one more and go a little bit over time slightly, which is about, sorry, these things are moving around a lot, I think. Where is it? Apologies. Here we go. Helen Jackson. What's the most effective way that high-level reports on, like Working Group 2 report on risks and impacts, how can that be translated into country-specific, you know, human welfare risks and impacts, and that can be communicated to non-experts? I wonder whether you've got some views on that, as you know, you spent quite a lot of time you know, agreeing the summary for policymakers, but how does this now feed into particular national decision-making level? It'd be good to hear your views on that one.
Well, perhaps I'll jump in. So, you know, my day job's at Natural England, and I'm a scientist there. I do science, but I also communicate science to policymakers and practitioners, and that's an important part of my job. I sometimes say it's a bit like a university academic, but I have policymakers and practitioners instead of students. And And I think that interface between the science and social science and policy and practice really matters. And I think it's a separate issue as well to the wider public communication. And it's giving appropriate information to people in specific sectors that they need. And that may involve some level of detail. I think it also involves bringing together practical expertise. So I think there's definitely a big step beyond reports like this one to translate it into reality. And some of it's about human contact, and it's about informing the people who are there on the ground. So just in my context, we have people who go around and work with farmers, giving advice to them on land management. Well, it's down to me to make sure that those farm advisors are trained and understand, and I can talk to them, I can present them with more digested bits of information and give them pointers. And, there'll be analogies in other areas as well. But we'll see what colleagues think.
I think it's also important that the report gives us ideas of which we can translate. So we are doing a global assessment. We are not doing countrywide assessments. And the Committee for Climate Change Adaptation report has done some of that just a few months ago. We heard that in the same seminar series. But I think such adaptation feasibility assessments, those pathways, some of the methodology we have developed is something which can be translated to the national or even subnational scale to formulate what a plan could look like at a given place. It's also, draw on us. We have spent the last 4 years of our life breathing this, much more than we ever intended to. And we would like to help. We are more than happy to do more specific information sharing and delve into specific areas in other contexts, because we have thought about this to a huge degree.
Okay, great, thanks. I've got one quick question, which is based around, your view of the, I guess the plenary, the IPCC plenary you've just experienced over the last 2 weeks in terms of adopting this summary for policymakers. Your message is quite stark, isn't it? It is, we've got a small window of opportunity to act. So I guess I wonder, all these governments have agreed to this now. So what's your view in terms of future action in this space of adaptation, given that you spent, 15 days or 2 weeks interacting with governments around the world? What's your view in terms of, how quickly we'll be able to act in terms of, adapting to some of these risks, which are unavoidable, as Mike said a little earlier?
So that what happens in those sessions is something which has to stay in those sessions, because it's a discussion of trust, and it's a very open and frank discussion. There are sentences which we've discussed one sentence for 6 hours. So believe me, they have engaged. I think it's really important, as you just said, is that this is not a product of academics. This is a joint product. We determine that the science is right, but every sentence has been agreed, and has been agreed by countries who you might perceive negative about some of the consequences of reducing emissions or the consequences it has for development. They've all signed this. They've all agreed to every single line of this. And believe me, some of these we have argued a lot about.
Yeah, it's worth saying, if there is an account of the discussions in the Earth, published by the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. So you can read quite a bit of this. Some of it you might have to read between the lines. As Daniela says, there are certain things we're probably not going to spell out, but you will get the sense of it. But no, at the end of the day, they've signed up to it. And the quote about being a brief and rapidly closing window of opportunity, that wasn't an opinion. That's an evidence-based statement. It's a statement of fact that governments have accepted. The summary of policymakers is a different beast to the rest of the report. The rest of the report, we have the final say as authors. The summary of policymakers has to be accepted by governments. They can't rewrite it for us, but they can put to us questions, and we hold the pen, as they say, but it can't be released until they've given it the sign off. So, and actually most of the really hard-hitting stuff, in fact all of it, has come through. So I think it's really important that actually that other people as well as ourselves are prepared to hold governments to account. And most of the delegations are composed of subject matter experts in government departments, rather it's not generally the politicians that are there. But nevertheless, they're people who go, with the authority of their nations behind them. So I think, it's now a matter perhaps of getting this out more into civil society, into public opinion, and, democratic processes in countries like ours, holding politicians to account. The big challenge is around resources and competing priorities. And we're firmly in the political space now, but we all know the other factors that will affect them. We, in a way, we've done what we can. We will go on communicating and sharing the science, but we're not politicians, we're not lobbyists. So, I think it's for others really to decide where to go with it. But I think we've given a really clear picture, a really firmly evidence-based picture of where we stand. And over to you, Ronald, really.
Okay. Nope, totally agree, Mike. Thanks both for those reflections. Hopefully this webinar contributes in the dissemination of the IPCC key messages. Thank you very much, James, Mike, Daniela, for participating. It only rests me to add that we indeed have a part 2 to this webinar. So on Wednesday, we've got one of my colleagues, Professor Leah Baran-Ford, coming to join the webinar, and Diana Ricken, who's CLA of the decision-making options for managing risks. So we'll start looking a little bit at some of the human dimensions of climate change. So do come and join us if you can. And then later in the month, we'll go back to our normal UKCR webinar series, where we'll be focusing on the development of a national framework for climate services for the UK. So join us if you can. But apologies for running a little bit over, but all the recording and the PowerPoints will be put on our website. So thank you very much for attending, and hopefully see some of you on Wednesday next week. Thanks again, and goodbye.